This morning, the book that changed a city forever. 30 years after it was first published, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil has been re-released with a new afterword. Midnight spent 216 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, more than any other nonfiction book in history. Its eccentric characters highlighted the city of Savannah, a place once sleepy, then suddenly thrust into a national spotlight following a series of homicide trials. The spotlight still hasn't faded. Savannah, Georgia, home of the historic Bonaventure Cemetery, elegant squares under Spanish moss. It's a beacon for visitors to the American South. A lot of that thanks to this man from up north.
I lived in this neighborhood. This is pristine. It's more than pristine because some of the houses that needed fixing up hadn't been done when I got here. Now they're all in great shape.
John Berendt began coming here from New York City in the 1980s and became so enamored that he decided to write a book. When you were writing it, did you ever imagine it would have the success that it did?
As I was writing it, my feeling was, this is really working. And I never thought it would be a bestseller.
Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil was a smash hit, selling more than 5 million copies and leading to a movie from Clint Eastwood.
Yes, I am nouveau riche, but then it's the riche that counts, now isn't it?
The book is centered around the true story of Jim Williams, an antiques dealer charged with killing his young lover, Danny Hansford, in this very room in Savannah's famed Mercer House.
You've never gotten tired of talking about all this.
Savannah, this house, Jim Williams, per se, because he was a charming, brilliant, extremely funny person. Told great stories.
But it wasn't just Williams or his 4 criminal trials that people couldn't get enough of. It was his wild neighbors.
I was not just following the story of the shooting, as much as meeting people around Savannah and creating the sensation of living in this beautiful town with these very quirky people.
Characters like the late Lady Chablis, the outrageous drag queen, who Eastwood cast to play herself in the film. We spoke to Berendt at Club One, where Chablis frequently performed. If you enjoyed the show, my name is the Lady Chablis, and if you didn't, I have a motto.
2 tears in a bucket, mother.
Sleeper.
Yeah.
I have to remember that one.
No, don't remember that one. That's off the record.
Berendt also wrote about Minerva, a voodoo priestess.
You trying to work me, boy?
Luther Driggers, the man who kept threatening to poison the whole city.
If I were you, I wouldn't drink the water today.
And so many more.
Patrick do love his morning walk.
Savannahans love eccentric people.
What is it about Savannah, do you think, that brings out that eccentricity?
One thing about the South I noticed immediately when I got here was they love to talk. And what do you talk about most? Other people. I could get a lot of information about that person from that person, and a lot of information about that person from that person.
People who read this book didn't just fall in love with the characters, they fell in love with you.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. That's the first time I've heard that directly. But it was a story that was so engaging. It was not hard to let the reader know I was having a wonderful time.
Berendt didn't actually visit Savannah until after the death of Hansford, so some of his second-hand accounts were presented first person. He says, all in service of the story.
I wrote it the way I wrote it because the narrative flowed just right. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad I did that because it enabled the book to be much more enjoyable the way I wrote it. And I'm not sorry a bit.
It is hard to imagine readers wanting it any other way. We watched as the current mayor of Savannah came up to Berendt.
Good, welcome home.
John's first time back since before COVID, and congratulated him for saving the city.
This is a man who turned us from a sleepy town and woke the world up. So 16 million visitors, so thanks to you.
Indeed, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil led to a flood of tourism.
The Hamilton Turner House was completed in 1883.
Tourism that, as we saw, has hardly tailed off.
You say it's Savannah on steroids today.
The pace is much faster, and there are more people.
Even though it's busier now, Savannah still looks like Savannah. Do you worry that could change?
I think the people running Savannah now know that they better not mess with it too much. And I expect that they will protect what's really great about the look of the town and how it works.
I was blown away by the number of tourists. It was my first time to Savannah ever, and we were talking about this.
Yeah,
you were
me
surprised
too.
It's tourists everywhere.
It's unbelievable. I was there like 2 years ago, and or last year, it was crazy.
Yeah.
It's all tourists down there.
I haven't been in 30 years. Shortly
Really?
after actually the book and the movie came out, it was this sleepy, it's almost celestial in many ways.
It is.
Yeah.
It's
really
gorgeous.
beautiful. It was nice to visit with him.
David Grann has spent nearly a year on the New York Times bestsellers list with his latest work, The Wager, and can also lay claim to the book, Killers of the Flower Moon, that inspired the film, now up for 10 Oscars tomorrow night. An award-winning journalist whose writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and New York Times, just to name a few, his foray into nonfiction exploded 15 years ago into mainstream success. 3 of his 6 books hit #1. Notoriety for a guy who preferred to remain unknown, but who appreciates getting the word out on his often untold histories.
I wish to find a lost city.
From the jungles of the Amazon
You said no one had been here before.
to the plains of Oklahoma,
Whose land is this?
My land.
even the notorious halls of San Quentin Penitentiary. David Grann's writing has taken readers and moviegoers alike through adventures far and wide.
So Hollywood seems to pick these up not in order.
Yes.
The first made into film was The Lost City of Z.
Yes.
Are we close?
And then came Old Man with a Gun.
I'd like to open up an account.
Well, great. What type of account do you have in mind?
This kind.
And now comes Killers of the Flower Moon.
Money flows freely here now.
It's very bewildering to me because I never think of these stories as movies. I really never do. I think of them as just, how am I going to create images in the reader's minds, visual images through words, but not through actual visuals.
He's left his mark on the literary world by uncovering thrilling tales otherwise lost to time, most written from this tiny home office, kept in a perpetual state of organized chaos.
What are you laughing at? You're making fun of my sacred room.
You didn't like put this all together for us, did
Well,
you?
I cleaned a space for us so we could walk in.
From precious documents and relics to photographs like these, which informed his research into the murders of Osage Native Americans.
I still have a fair amount of the Killers of the Flower Moon documents
wow.
around here.
Wow, this isn't in the book.
No, this photograph, I had a lot of photographs that were not in the book. It's kind of a way often of trying to chase history even as it's often vanishing.
His history began in New York City, the son of an oncologist and the first woman CEO of Putnam Penguin Publishing, though he says she didn't grant him any favors.
My mom always gave me one piece of advice, which is whatever you do, don't become a writer.
Shut up.
I swear. And I think she thought it was going to be too hard for me. She thought it would be like too hard a life. And so I, like any good son, I did the exact opposite. And I became a writer and I proved her wrong.
His grandmother was the one who fueled his passion for storytelling.
My grandfather had suffered a stroke, and my grandmother would tell me these stories about how he had fled from Russia on foot, how he was this daredevil who raced on motorcycles, how he went down the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan and crashed. And I just kept looking at this figure who really couldn't move much and talk, and yet suddenly she had brought him to life with me with these stories.
Which drove him to look beyond the surface with a little help from his favorite fictional private eye.
There's a great quote from Sherlock Holmes where he said, if we could just peer into the roof of all these other houses, we would find all these remarkable stories that the mind of humans could never invent. In other words, truth is stranger than fiction. And I've always kind of believed that. And so I'm like a professional snoop. Every time I hear a conversation, I'm overhearing, taking little notes.
His sixth book, The Wager, a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder in the mid-18th century, is no exception.
I come upon this 18th century account written by a midshipman named John Berendt, who was only 16 years old when he set sail on the voyage. But then, you know, I think the key is I actually read it. Because when you start reading it, it's written in this really old English. I think most people, and even me, when I first started reading it, I was like, what is this? It's kind of faded. But then if you actually keep reading, you're like, wait a second, shipwreck, mutiny, starvation. So I think it's just that curiosity to just kind of keep following the thread and see where it leads you. And sometimes it will lead you nowhere. But if you keep pulling, you'll end up usually somewhere pretty darn interesting.
Grann admits his attention to detail is obsessive.
I'll do about 2 years of research, and then I start to get gnawed by some doubt. And then before I know it, I'll do something foolish like go traipsing through the Amazon, chasing some explorer who disappeared in the 1920s.
Or the Antarctic.
Yes, or go on a little boat to Wager Island. It ends up breathing life and deepening my understanding.
On average, he spends 5 years on each book, which often stems from ideas meant to satisfy his magazine editors.
So the pitch for The Old Man and the Gun.
Yeah, the pitch, well, you know what's funny about the pitch for The Old Man and the Gun? There was the first story I ever pitched to The New Yorker. And I was so nervous, I was like, I can't mess up this story. I mean, the elements are just too good. It was about this guy who was robbing banks into his 70s. And then he was breaking out of prisons, and he broke out of San Quentin in a kayak on the side in which he rub-a-dub-dub. He painted on the side. So I thought, I can't mess up that story.
Do you feel the responsibility of telling untold, hidden histories?
Yes, because I think part of what interests me is to shine a light on things that have been obscured, often obscured for a reason. There was a certain intent to erase history.
How does David Grann maintain his incredible lightness of being?
We're gonna go see the Knicks.
And the Hornets.
We're gonna see the Knicks win.
Oh, you think so?
I do. You wanna bet? No. If you don't have a release, if you don't have an escape, you will lose your mind. I spend way too much time like evaluating prospects, looking at like the financial statements of players and will they fit with the team, and listening to podcasts. There's way too much Knicks and NBA devotion.
Do you ever wager a few?
You know, I don't wager. I'm too neurotic to wager. Because to bet, you need to be rational. And the one space where I want to be irrational is in the space of sports.
It's a pretty safe bet. He won't be giving up either obsession anytime soon. He's already started work on his next book.
I have a little idea now, so we will see. I'm not ready yet to talk about it, but I'm circling around it.
What part of the world? Can you at least tease us on that?
Espionage. So we'll see.
So the subject, not the location, now known. He's feeling the pressure to finish it.
You say, what's the pressure? That's the pressure. I just want to retire.
Can you?
No, not yet.
I was so struck by how lighthearted and just fun David Grann was. He was just a delight to interview, but just so incredibly serious about his subject matter, and he really takes it to heart. It was the case that captured the nation, a seemingly all-American couple accused of espionage during the height of the anti-communist McCarthy era. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg's fight to clear their names became the trial of the century, and their fate made history. Their death sentence was also the most infamous decision of an ambitious federal court judge eyeing his place in history, and the subject of a new book, Judgment and Mercy.
Dateline Sing Sing, June 19th, 1953.
It was the first high-profile espionage case of the Cold War. A married couple accused of spying for the Soviet Union by providing top-secret information on the atomic bomb. Once convicted, the fates of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were in the hands of Second Circuit federal court judge Irving R. Kaufman.
I think he viewed their betrayal not just as a betrayal of the United States, but almost as a personal betrayal of him.
It took author Martin Siegel 30 years to pen Judgment and Mercy, driven by his need to understand a man he clerked for as a Harvard law graduate.
I wanted people to have a more complete and kind of nuanced understanding of this long and important career that goes beyond simply the Rosenberg case.
A career that spanned more than 5 decades, and oddly enough, a reversal in ideology, but Siegel says never in personality.
What was he like?
He was famous for being a difficult boss.
Cantankerous?
Cantankerous, a yeller, would humiliate and embarrass law clerks. No work was ever good enough.
But in 1992, 6 months into Siegel's clerkship, Kaufman died of pancreatic cancer.
The rabbi was up there in the middle of a eulogy, and a man stood up behind me and yelled, "He murdered the Rosenbergs, let him rot in hell." I was just astonished in 1992 that people still cared enough to show up and disrupt and infiltrate his funeral. I couldn't believe it, and that's what started me thinking about this guy would be a fascinating subject for a book.
Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1910, Kaufman was the child of Jewish immigrants, growing up in tenements on the Lower East Side.
He seemed to be fighting his roots.
Yeah, in some ways he seemed almost embarrassed by them. He had this rags to riches upbringing. He seemed to want the world to think that he'd always been on Park Avenue, where he ended up.
His meteoric rise began in 1931 after graduating from Fordham Law School at the tender age of 21.
He was called the Demon Boy prosecutor, as this kind of famous lawyer in the city handling major cases in his 20s. He's appointed a federal judge in 1939, and he's the second youngest in America.
According to Siegel, he was meticulous, calculating every move as a prosecutor to get assigned high-profile cases by courting influential people.
We of the FBI feel that we're a part of a team.
Power brokers like the nation's infamous FBI chief, J. Edgar Hoover.
This is a lot of correspondence between Judge Kaufman and J. Edgar Hoover.
But this is like 49.
This is 49, but this is when Judge Kaufman is jockeying for an appointment to the United States District Court. I merely say amen to all the tributes that are being paid to you. In my opinion, you are the greatest public servant of our time. So that's the kind of typical flattery that streamed pretty constantly from New York down to Washington.
He even got his family in on the act.
One of his sons wrote a letter which says, "Dear Mr. Hoover, are you having a nice time in Washington? We are having a nice time in camp."
So this is from one of his children?
Yeah, this is one of his children.
Oh my goodness. And that is taking brown-nosing to a whole new level.
That's the full court family press is what's going on there.
All with one goal in mind, he says, to reach the United States Supreme Court.
High-profile cases just seem to keep landing in his lap.
Yeah, that wasn't an accident. He knew how to work the system. He knew how to get those cases.
Kaufman lobbied to get assigned to the Rosenberg trial and got his slot thanks to a junior prosecutor on the case by the name of Roy Cohn, known as an architect of McCarthy's Red Scare.
It does sometimes seem as if Judge Kaufman went into that trial persuaded of their guilt. And that's almost jumps off the page when you read the transcript, because he's constantly intervening in the questioning, almost always to help the prosecution. So he gave himself a week between the end of the trial until pronouncing sentence to mull it. And he came back with the death sentences for both.
He sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair.
His decision, while popular in the moment, would later backfire, with calls for his resignation in the 1970s, even a rebuke by a sitting Supreme Court justice.
Justice Frankfurt actually vowed to stay on the Supreme Court long enough so that Judge Kaufman would be too old to replace him. That's how personal Justice Frankfurter took it. The criticism he was subjected to for decades over the Rosenberg case.
The irony? His rulings after the Rosenberg trial were consequential. A 1961 school desegregation case in New Rochelle, New York, was the first in the North.
So he had no patience at all for any kind of defense of segregation or for the message that came to African Americans there, which was, as it was around the country, just wait.
Be patient.
Be patient. We'll eventually get around to this. We'll build a new school. We'll fix it. He ordered them to integrate then and there.
I wanted to see Grand Canyon and all the other things.
An immigration trial featuring the Beatles' very own John Lennon.
So the John Lennon case was an attempt by the Nixon administration to basically retaliate against Lennon for his political activities, anti-war activity.
That seemed an almost about face of his intentions earlier on in his career.
Yeah, I think he always kind of sided with the immigrant.
And cases concerning the Vietnam War.
Probably the most important had to do with the draft and conscientious objection. And he issued a decision holding that you could be a conscientious objector and exempt from service, not just on the basis of religious belief, but also on the basis of moral objection.
You've just been vindicated.
That ruling helped lay the groundwork for the Supreme Court reversal of Muhammad Ali's draft conviction, a win that allowed the boxer's comeback.
When we think about those decisions, they're fundamental to how we see America today.
He's at the forefront of these critical civil liberties issues that are percolating up in the Vietnam era, in the civil rights era, and then into the 1970s and 80s. And he sort of has his fingerprints all over these important controversies that they're still raging today.
Yeah, he definitely had a legacy. Obviously, never made it to the Supreme Court of the United States, but Ronald Reagan did award him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So, you know, accent marks, quotation marks all over his career in terms of highs and lows. Fascinating character.
I like
Really
his kids writing to,
I know.
to Hoover with something.
That is, you said that very diplomatically, the ultimate in brown nose.
This morning, The Path to Paradise, a Francis Ford Coppola story. Coppola is best known for the Godfather movies. But as Sam Wasson makes clear in his bold new book, that was never Coppola's peak vision. We've talked to Wasson before. He's one of the best at writing about the lives of artists. With Coppola, he found someone who was still hungry, not just about his new massive, big-budget, self-funded film, but someone who still dreams of reinventing the way we make movies.
Did you always want to do a Coppola book?
I always wanted to do a book about zoetrope because it, to me, is the real Coppola, because people think Coppola is the Godfather. That's what he is deepest in his heart, but it's zoetrope.
Zoetrope is the Francis Ford Coppola dream. A dream that began in Queens, New York, when Coppola, the son of second-generation Italian immigrants, was stricken with polio as a child.
In his solitude, in his isolation, he creates a better world for himself. And in that sense, he's the archetypal artist.
By the late 1960s, Coppola had made his first few movies, and along with George Lucas, was at the forefront of the new Hollywood.
Hey, you're supposed to be the fast thing in the valley, man, but that can't be your car. It must be your mama's car.
That's when Coppola and Lucas originally founded Zoetrope, as Coppola explained to a local reporter in 1969.
I think we're going to make a lot of films that will make money, and I think we'll make a lot of films that will not make money. But hopefully all the films we'll make will films that someone wanted to make desperately and enjoyed and loved making. That's the big thing.
Coppola famously did not enjoy making The Godfather, but Zoetrope needed cash, and a difficult shoot produced an American classic.
You come into my house on the day my daughter's to be married and you ask me to do murder. Money.
Godfather's success allowed Coppola to make The Conversation.
Since when are you here to be entertained? Here.
Next was Godfather Part 2.
I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Then Apocalypse Now.
What do you know about surfing, Major? You're from goddamn New Jersey.
Something all those films had in common, an emphasized use of sound as a storytelling device.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
A technique perfected here, in the basement of the landmark Sentinel Building in San Francisco. It's a huge part of Apocalypse Now.
Huge part of Apocalypse Now, a huge part of the Godfather movies. It's what the conversation is about. And here we are where they recorded Martin Sheen's voiceover.
Saigon. I'm still only in Saigon.
The spoils of Coppola's success with Apocalypse Now allowed him to expand Zoetrope, a studio meant to be run by artists for artists, without the corporate interference of a typical Hollywood setup. But the underperformer Zoetrope turned out had everyone wondering what happened to the master.
What happened was that, like every great filmmaker, he is a gambler. And he gambled on Apocalypse Now and hit the big time.
Don't look at the camera, just go by like you're fighting! Like you're fighting, don't look at the camera!
And with that money, he took that money and put it into his next project, which was the creation of the Dream Studio, Zoetrope Studios. And he put all of his money on black, and it came up red.
Which is not to say Coppola didn't find ways over the coming decades to leave his mark. He and his wife raised a family. He built, ran, and sold a winery. Zoetrope has produced over 90 projects under its banner, but a definitive masterpiece has remained elusive. Until now. Maybe. Coppola is about to release Megalopolis, costing a reported $120 million, all out of his own pocket.
All of you have been fantastic collaborators. I appreciate it so much.
Megalopolis deals with how to rebuild a broken city. Perhaps a parable for Coppola's life. Because, as Sam Wasson makes clear, in The Path to Paradise, Coppola still wants to make his vision of Zoetrope happen.
It's a system that really embraces trial and error, new technologies, new means of distribution that Francis had imagined back in the 80s before we even had the technology to implement them. Now we have the technology, which streaming approximates. So you can cut down on a lot of these external expenditures that are now so baked into the movie business, and so many jobs and livelihoods rely on them, but the product doesn't and the audience doesn't.
It is hard to argue any other filmmaker has had higher highs and lower lows than Francis Ford Coppola. At the age of 84, he remains convinced betting bigger than anyone else is the only way to live, and the only way to change the world.
That's what Francis wants. I mean, that's what Francis wants. Francis wants utopia. A movie is a little community, a little way to practice the ideal community. And in that sense, it's a rehearsal for utopia. And so is a studio. I mean, is it really crazy to spend your life thinking about how you can make the perfect place?
Is it really crazy to spend your life thinking about ways to create the perfect place?
No, I do it all the time.
Yeah,
but I can't execute the way Francis
he's
tried to.
As we talked about, he's had trouble doing that as well, but he keeps on trying.
I love that about him, and everything about him, and I love that he's been so devoted to his family. I love that his daughter has taken up the helm of his craft. I love the winery. He's just seems so delightful.
He said something interesting in the book that he's like, I love that my daughter has exceeded in film what I've done. Like, isn't that always the goal?
You want your kids to exceed what you
do better than you do?
Speaking of kids, you might say he developed a passion for recycling at an early age, like the age of 3. We'll see the amazing place it's taken him a decade later. For some of you, your local news is next. The rest stick around. You're watching CBS Saturday Morning.